No, there's Councillor Gropp. Good afternoon. I hate to hear that, Louis. How are you feeling? You feel okay?
I feel totally fine. I don't feel anything at all. I feel fine. The only thing that's
Mr. Chair, sorry to interrupt, but we are now live and good to go.
Okay.
I call this meeting to order. This is the Public Safety Committee of the City Council. All committee members are present today via Zoom. This is a remote or online meeting where all participants will be on a video or audio conference. We appreciate your patience as meetings are conducted this way. Members of the public, city staff, and the media have the ability to view this meeting live through YouTube and Zoom webinar. The live stream can be accessed from most smartphones, tablets, or computers. For those watching on the live stream, thank you for joining us. No written comments were received for today's meeting. Members of the public have the opportunity to address the committee if they have signed up for live public comment per the rules published on the agenda and our website Friday. If you are watching the YouTube live feed for this meeting, please mute or turn it off when you are called upon to speak. We will call for the speakers when we get to individuals' agenda item they signed up for. Here are the public comment ground rules. Comments are to be addressed to the committee members only. Each participant has 2 minutes to present. Please keep your comments germane to the topics on the agenda. Any disruptive conduct will result in removal from the Zoom meeting room. There will be 2-minute time limit when you are called upon to speak. The timer will start once you begin speaking. The Zoom moderator, Mr. Moyle, will let you know when your time is up. At this point, we will move on to agenda item A, 0-81. Councillor Benton, would you like to move your bill?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just a moment, please. Mr. Chair, I'll move approval of O2181. This is repealing Chapter 11, Article 14th of the revised ordinances of the city, the marijuana possession ordinance. And I'll move a recommendation of due pass.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. Councillors, is there any questions for the staff or the administration?
I think you had a second there from Councillor Bassan, if I'm not mistaken.
There you go. Okay.
You're correct.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, I have a statement.
Councillor Davis, did you have a second, or are you ready, or would you have a comment?
I think Councillor Bassan offered the second, and if it's okay, Mr. Chair, I have a brief comment about the legislation.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, relating to this item, next item, one of those things that says we want to be over and explaining ourselves. I think most folks know that in my day job, I do work with some of the legal cannabis in New Mexico, and I've already disclosed I would recuse myself from any votes involving business dealings between those companies and the city. But this is just a procedural motion to criminal ordinance that's been outdated by the state. So I don't have any conflicts on this today, but want to make clear those differences. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Any councilors, any other questions or comments?
If I may, Mr. Chair, just quickly, I was asked to sponsor this ordinance. It essentially is a cleanup, you know, as I think the general public knows and the councilors know. The state did pass updates to the State Controlled Substances Act, and essentially we're to some extent preempted, but certainly have to be in accordance with state law. And I guess I'll ask if there are any technical questions on this. I would refer them to Mr. Melendres, but this and the next bill have to do just with, as their title state, getting us into conformance with state law and not have prohibitions on our books that aren't consistent with state law.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Mr. Melendres, can you kind of give a little brief in reference to what this cleanup bill entails, please?
Mr. Chair, I'll actually defer to Julia Couladon in our office. She did the research on this bill and is prepared to comment.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, councilors. So as we know, in April of 2021, the state of New Mexico enacted the Cannabis Regulation Act, which authorizes possession, consumption, purchase, processing, manufacturing, and transportation of cannabis and cannabis-related products. The State Controlled Substances Act was also updated to remove equipment, products, materials, et cetera, that are associated with cannabis use from its definition of drug paraphernalia. The city's marijuana possession ordinance currently classifies the possession of marijuana and or paraphernalia as civil violations, which are punishable by a monetary fine. And so the city's marijuana possession ordinance, as Councilor Benton said, is now in conflict with these changes to state law. And to comply with these changes, this bill 081 would just repeal the marijuana possession ordinance in its entirety.
All right, thank you, Julia. Councilors, any other questions or comments? Okay, move to vote. Ms. Montoya?
Counselor Bassan.
Yes.
Counselor Benton.
Yes.
Counselor Davis.
Yes.
Counselor Grout.
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez.
Yes.
And that passes on a 5-0 vote.
Thank you. We will now move on to agenda item B, 0-82. Councilor Benton, would you like to move your bill?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll move recommendation of a due pass on 082. This is amending Chapter 12, Article 4, Section 10 of the revised ordinances of the City of Albuquerque, which is for unlawful advertisement, manufacture, and delivery of drug paraphernalia to conform to the New Mexico Cannabis Regulation Act and MSA 78, et cetera. So yeah, move a due pass.
Councilors, any questions for staff or administration?
I'll offer a second for the record, Mr. Chair.
Second, noted. I have a couple of comments as well, and I'm not 100% sure based on the way it's written. I would like to get an explanation from Julia again. Being a retired police officer, I'd like to make sure, actually I'm a retired narcotics officer, actually did that for a while too. One of the things that concerns me more than anything on this one in reference to drug paraphernalia is the fact that is there a distinction built in, and this is for Julia to make sure, because this drug paraphernalia can be used for more than one ingestion of different types of drugs. You could use a pot pipe for fentanyl ingestion, meth or crack ingestion, and I just want to make sure that there's something in here that states that there is a breakdown, and if there's residue of any of the other substances, that it would still be considered a drug paraphernalia.
Mr. Chair, To answer your question, yes, there are references in this bill to other forms of drug paraphernalia, but in the amendments that we made, we were careful to focus those and tailor it to just marijuana-related use. You'll see throughout the bill some of the strike-throughs. For example, on page 3, line 21, it's specifically a form of paraphernalia related to marijuana, and it has that verbiage in it specifically. We were cognizant of the fact that some of these items might be used for other purposes, but we did our best to be careful and only strike out marijuana-related use.
Okay. So I just want to make sure and certain that that if an officer out on the street picks up, ends up with dealing with drug paraphernalia, and it's an individual who is using it for fentanyl, because fentanyl is our #1 issue right now, that if there is not marijuana residue, just want to make sure, and that it could be fentanyl, crack, or methamphetamine. So I just want to make sure that is correct.
Mr. Chair, I would say that is correct, yes.
Okay. And I noted a second for Councilor Davis. So councilors ready for the vote? Ms. Montoya?
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez.
Yes.
That passes on a 5-0 vote.
We will now move on to agenda item C, which is R-209. Councilor Benton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. R-209 is amending the declaration of local emergency due to novel coronavirus COVID-19 to require vaccination of certain city employees. I'm going to move, my motion is to the full council without recommendation.
Is there a second? Councilor Davis, a second.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, I know we've got a public individual signed up to speak, but just quickly, I realize this is perhaps a hot potato, certainly for some of us and some members of the public and some of our employees. I drafted this in October. As we know, this virus has been mutating and changing often, as have been public responses across the country. And I think it's worthy of a debate, and that's why I'm moving it for full council for full debate. But I also want to hear from the public commenter, but also hope that we can hear from the administration and their thinking on the bill. We've heard things, of course, in the media from responses from the public safety unions, both of them in opposition, and recognize that both of those unions' membership, or at least their leadership, seem to be opposed strongly, and many of their members, at least colloquially, we understand, are not vaccinated. But I'll leave it at that for the time being, Mr. Chair, and perhaps we could hear from the public commenter and then from the administration.
Okay, with that, Mr. Moya, I understand we have an individual signed up to speak on this item. Can you please call their name?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The individual that signed up for this item has not joined the meeting yet, so we won't have any comment on this one.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to hear what the administration has to say. And I also have the police union president, Mr. Willoughby, wanting to
Mr.
speak as well.
Mr. Willoughby, was that the person who signed up to speak, Julian?
Mr. Chair, Counselor Benton, Mr. Willoughby is signed up, but he's signed up for bills R22-1 and EC 2218. He was not signed up for this item.
Okay. Then I would like certainly to hear from the administration on this. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Councilor Davis also has a question.
Okay. I'd really like to hear from the police union as well. I don't know if he's signed up, but I don't know if I need to defer to Mr. Melendres to see if that's okay.
Mr. Chair, it's your discretion to hear from potential speakers who are in the room.
Okay,
So
I'd
it's your
definitely like to hear what the police union president has to say.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much for the opportunity. I actually made a mistake. I wanted to speak on this bill. We definitely support 22, but I hit the wrong button. So I appreciate you affording me the opportunity to speak today. Like Councilor Benton said, I think that this bill is from a different time. We've done a lot in the United States since this bill was drafted. We have a decision from the Supreme Court in the OSHA standards, and I will tell you this, Mr. Chair and council members, I have no problem criticizing the City of Albuquerque Police Department. It's one of the things I do on a regular basis. And the City of Albuquerque Police Department's response to COVID was excellent. I feel that they went above and beyond in caring for the Albuquerque police officers, not only the police officers, but their family. I think they were highly organized, just sanitizing areas with COVID. I think their response should be commended at a level that I've never experienced in my career at the Albuquerque Police Department. We have since moved past this. We have an agreement with the city about how to move forward after the OSHA standards. I think that a vaccine mandate is divisive. It's one of the most divisive conversations in this country. We do have a lot of officers in the Albuquerque Police Department that are not vaccinated and don't plan to be vaccinated. I think that this is going to cause detriment to the Albuquerque Police Department and our ability to provide safety to this community. I'm one of those people. I had COVID early on. I was very sick. It was not enjoyable whatsoever, but because I have natural immunity, I chose not to take the shot. That decision has served me well. At the time when we were really getting into this battle with the city of Albuquerque regarding the OSHA mandate, 86% of the individuals that had COVID at the time were fully vaccinated. So I don't believe that the science is really clear on this issue. I think it's divisive, and a lot of your police officers do not support it. We do support, however, wearing masks and keeping each other safe and reporting to the city if we don't feel well. It's hard for your officers because they like to go to work when they're sick. It's just part of our culture. But we just don't feel that this is necessary, and we hope that this bill does not pass. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Councilor Benton, thank you so much for bringing this bill forward. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak before you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Willoughby.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I'd rather hear from the councilors, and then we'll go to the administration, if that's all right with you.
That's fine. Councilors, any questions or comments?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate Mr. Willoughby. I'm always good to see you. It's good to see you here. You're right. You have no problem criticizing our department when you feel it's appropriate. And I do appreciate that you are willing to give them credit for, and I think credit to this council for weighing in to provide the PPEs, to reallocate funds, to be sure that we provided safe equipment and bought new equipment when it was needed for extra vehicles and extra day-to-day equipment so that officers didn't have to deal with contaminated or reused equipment in the field. And we all adapted, and I appreciate that. But on this point, I think I'm going to disagree with Mr. Willoughby, and he knows that. Like Mr. Chair, I was a police officer too, right? I was a police officer in DC during 9/11 with the anthrax attacks. It was our job to be there as a U.S. Capitol Police officer in those facilities, outside those facilities during those. And we had to take prescribed drugs that were for us to prevent anthrax so that we could stand our post, because our job required us to be there no matter what. And that is part of that job. That is that ethos. And so my concern is that, and I said this yesterday in our FGO meeting, and I'll bring it back up when this comes to the full council. I do, for the record, support sending this to full council for a broader discussion. But I do think it's different for public safety folks. When this was an emergency use only authorization, when the vaccines were under EUA, I agreed that folks should be able to weigh the science and the details on their own, but the science is clear. It's safe now. It does prevent infection. It does keep us safer. It keeps our workplaces safer by not having this here. And I don't mean to undermine any of the employees or employers in our city, but we saw that during COVID, I would support the sponsor extending this to all city employees, but I understand that we want to narrowly focus this for this conversation, because we saw that bus drivers and transit drivers, when transit was closed, were detailed to provide meals for seniors who were homebound. And certainly we didn't want those folks bringing COVID to those recipients who needed those services. And in the same way, we have a public safety crisis. We need as many officers and PSAs and dispatchers available, and fire folks available for our city on call when someone needs help. And this is a common sense, easy way for those folks to ensure that they come to work prepared. We already require them to meet a higher standard of health and fitness in order to perform their duties and be prepared to answer that call. I don't think this is beyond the pale of that. Further, I support this, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to hear the administration's response when we get to them, if they would make a note here. I would like to, this is not a mandate per se. It says you either get a vaccine or you participate in regular testing to ensure that you are not contagious to others. There's an easy opt-out, an easy piece there, an easy alternative for those that choose not to get vaccinated. I would be interested if the department can tell us some of the anonymized data on how many persons have opted out and participated in that testing program so they can remain available to work. I just don't see anyone quitting for this. I think there's an option that's totally doable, a reasonable common sense solution. And I think it's incumbent on our public safety folks to do what's right to be sure they're there when we need them. And I appreciate the sponsor for this effort. And I hope the mayor would support us in this when we get back to that. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Davis. Councilor Bassan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My apologies for no camera yet, but I really, really hope that people will choose to get vaccinated. But at the same time, I do not support mandating it. And I recognize with what Councilor Davis is saying, when you offer a choice, it's not considered a mandate. The problem I have with offering a choice of testing or getting the vaccine is that there are people that I know that have gone to school or gone to work, and they did rapid tests that were negative, and the schools or the employers have let them come to work because even though they thought they might be symptomatic, they still went and they did their duties. And sure enough, 5 days later, they did another test and it was positive. Or the reverse, where we go and we get tested and it is taking longer than it used to because of the different supply demands and more, that people aren't getting the results of the test they take for several days, if not almost a week sometimes. And they don't just stay home from the time they test till 7 days later when they get a result. You're supposed to stay home for 5 days if you're symptomatic, or until you test negative, or 5 days after when you tested positive. There's such a moving target with this that I don't believe that offering this option at this time is going to be beneficial for our first responders when we counted on them to go into the lines fighting hard for us 2 years ago, and they didn't back down, and they did their job and they put themselves at risk. So to me, because of the science and because of the delays and because of truly what I believe is a moving target with testing, I don't support this this is the only two options. I think people should hopefully choose to get vaccinated. I believe it will keep you safer. I believe it will keep you healthier, but that should be an individual person's choice and response.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. I'd like to hear if any other councilors like to say something in reference to this.
Mr. Chair, I don't support it being mandatory. I think that it should be a choice. I too think that getting a vaccine is important, but making it mandatory is divisive. We already have a public safety crisis in our city, and we will lose officers, more officers. I think we need to let them have a choice. I highly recommend getting the vaccine, but it should be a choice.
Thank you, Councilor Grout. And I would like to hear from the administration, if the administration would like to chime in.
Mr. Chair and councilors, thank you for having us. What I'd like to say is that earlier in the year, when we thought either getting a vaccination or getting tested was going to be required, we started implementing the rules, and we found that there were significant issues with collective bargaining units. When this started to go into effect, some collective bargaining units actually filed a restraining order against the city. So these types of rules this type of stuff isn't that simple. There's a lot of things that have to be done before something like that can be done. And that's what we found earlier when we were trying to do something similar to this for all employees throughout the city and not just public safety.
Thank you, administration.
If I may respond to that before you speak, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, just quickly as a clarification only, not to a rebuttal or anything, but the bill does recognize that this would have to go through negotiation with both of the respective unions.
Thank you, administration, and thank you, Councilor Benton. I want to make some comments as well. As you said earlier, Councilor Benton, that this is an old bill. It's already 4 months old in an ever-changing world of this coronavirus. I went through the bill line by line, and I noticed that the bill also talks about Delta being the primary factor, and now it looks like we're in Omicron. I also on line 22 says that we're in an upward slide, and I honestly believe from the statistics that we are on a downward slide. There's several other things. I don't think there's any proof to show anywhere that any of our public safety employees have actually been responsible for transmitting the disease or even being carriers. They respond to thousands of calls every single day of the week, and they get the virus whether they're vaccinated or not. So I mean, there's more. I can go on to every line. And now we also have the federal government stating that they're going to stay away from this subject for now. So based on all the comments that I've heard, the collective bargaining issue, and then also the fact that this is a very old bill, I can't support the motion at this time. And so I move for a vote.
Councilor Bassan.
Can you please repeat the motion?
It was being sent to full council without recommendation.
I actually,
Yes.
I move right now instead of moving it there for a not pass.
Mr. Chair, the motion on the floor that you must dispose of first is the without recommendation motion.
Okay.
You can't make another motion until that one has been disposed of unless it's like a motion to defer.
Okay. So we're voting on the motion to move without recommendation.
Correct. Councilor Bassan.
Yes.
Councilor Benton.
Yes.
Councilor Davis.
Yes.
Councilor Grout.
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez?
No.
That passes on a 4-1 vote.
Okay, we will now move to agenda item D, R-1. And I'm moving R1 for Councilor Lewis. And R1 is directing the city administration to evaluate recent Attorney General guidance and assess reopening and renegotiating the court-approved settlement agreement between the city of Albuquerque and the U.S. Department of Justice. Move a do pass. Councilors, any questions for staff or administration? Councilor Bassan.
I'm offering a second, Mr. Chair.
Second by Councilor Bassan. Mr. Moya, I understand we have an individual signed up to speak on this item.
Mr. Chair, yes, it was Mr. Willoughby, but I'm not sure if this was the one that he mistakenly chosen to. Sean, did you want to provide comment for this bill?
Yes, if I could, please. The whole system was a little confusing for me, and I'm not a technology buff, so I would like to give support for this if possible.
Your time will begin once you start speaking. You have 2 minutes, and please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and councilors. I know that the administration is kind of changing direction with our relationship with DOJ, and any help that the council or any other arm within the state of New Mexico that can help us will be greatly beneficial. This entire program has been an utter disaster from Jump Street. We need all the help we can get, and we are not absolutely without fault. The city of Albuquerque needs to change policies that will allow our officers to succeed. But I would just like to keep it fresh in your mind that the DOJ consent decree process, it hasn't worked anywhere. I ask the DOJ on a regular basis, give me one story of success, and nobody has a story. And I asked them, is it Seattle? Was Seattle a success after 8 years when they burnt down the police station and created the autonomous zone? Because the taxpayers, the police department, your constituents are the ones holding the bag of this failed blueprint called DOJ consent decrees, and anything you can do to help, we support it. Thank you so much for the legislation, Councilor Lewis. I hope that you pass this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Wilby. Also, I have Councilor Lewis, who is present, to elaborate and answer any questions.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to be available in case anybody had any questions regarding the bill. And really the intent was to give the council an opportunity to really for the council to give the administration the support for the opportunity to have some discussions with the federal court regarding Merrick Garland's, Attorney General Merrick Garland's recent recommendations regarding consent decrees. And I think they're applicable to our agreement, the situation that we're in, after 7 years now. And so this gives them the support and certainly the encouragement from the council to address those comments that were made by the Attorney General. And so essentially that's what this does. And like I said, Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to be here in case anybody had any questions.
Thank you. Councilors, any questions or comments? The only comment that I have is I think we're moving in the right direction. Everybody knows that 8 years of a consent decree has been a long time to be under a thumb. And I think it's time that we start making progress to move forward to deal with it in different ways. And councilors, if there's more comments or questions, yes.
I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt the chair. I think both Councilor Bassan and myself were in queue for question and comment before we close, Mr. Chair, if you have some more time on the schedule.
No, go ahead. I didn't see the hand. Sorry.
I think Councilor Bassan was before me, and I see the mayor's conference room also wanted to weigh in. So I would defer to Councilor Bassan first if she's available.
Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilor Davis. So I just have kind of a pie in the sky question, because I agree with what Mr. Willoughby said. I agree. I think we all pretty much agree that we got into this collective, or not collective, the CASA, because we had some serious problems, and we don't want to ever revert back to any of that. But I absolutely agree that we need to see what we can do about reducing the monitor's presence here in Albuquerque, and how do we become into compliance so that we can get there. My question is, in renegotiating this, if for some reason it were to come back, and maybe this is just a rhetorical question because I don't know if any of us would really know the answer, but if this were to come back where we wouldn't be able to renegotiate any kind of timelines or anything, I'm wondering if there would be a possibility to renegotiate getting a new monitor so that it almost starts us over, in not fully, but just to say, well, hey, well, if we can't end this timeline because we're in it till the bitter end, well, is there an idea of what can we do about who is monitoring? Maybe we need a fresh perspective. So I don't really think it's a question so much as it's a thought that I had about options in the potential for renegotiating, because perhaps there is some jaded, overdue, long-term, I can keep going with different analogies, but maybe it's time that if we can't end this, maybe we can start fresh to see how productive we can become.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And really quickly, I've had a chance. Let me back up. I was particularly concerned when I read in the Albuquerque Journal this weekend of the story I think some of us have been aware of for a while, about the number 80 plus homicide cases, for example, that have been languishing sort of uninvestigated, for lack of a better word. Some of these cases have been around since 4 or 5 years, under 3 police chiefs, under 2. And I want to commend the new administration, the new police chief, Medina staff, for acknowledging, talking to some of us about some of the shortcomings, investigations and other things, not just around CASA. But more importantly, the whole fact that we have so many uninvestigated profile cases lends me to believe that we have any number of uninvestigated, lower tier, but still important cases, including felonies, burglaries, assaults with a deadly weapon, all those cases that really have not gotten the attention that a fully staffed department would. I disagree with some of the positioning of the administration when we begin by saying that it is the fault of DOJ for taking too many people. DOJ has not changed. We signed this deal, but just before I in this city, or who's in charge, signed an agreement with the Department of Justice to follow constitutional policing principles and not violate people's rights. We have not had, to my knowledge, 14 or 15 now monitors reports. Now they're coming every 6 months instead of monthly. Not a single one where the monitor hasn't been able to randomly pull a list of 10 or 20 cases and find serious violations or failures by the department to meet those standards. I have no issue with asking DOJ to take a new look at what's expected of police departments around the country, and I think that's a good idea, and I support that part of this process and this resolution. And in that regard, I appreciate Councilor Lewis for bringing this, and I agree that where Councilor Lewis and the mayor can agree on a strategy forward on something, we ought to take a serious look because it probably deserves it. But I think we can't just say it's time for them to get out of the way. The fact is they're requiring more and more of our APD attention to deal with these issues because we're not doing a good job. We're not doing a feedback loop that shows continual improvement. We have more than 600 cases backlogged in internal affairs because of an administrative decision to stop investigating instead of trying to, I would have rather seen us try to move forward and work together better over those 6 months. By the way, a backlog that was not shared with the city council or the public, even though it was known. And so I'm concerned that we're not doing our job. I think the new administration in the police department is taking some tremendous steps forward. And I've seen some of the data. I got to talk to the chief this morning. I've seen some of the data that shows us that our traffic stop numbers are going up. Our officer engagements are going up. We're not using McClendon as a crutch anymore to say we're not going to deal with small things that can help make our neighborhoods better. But we have a long way to go. And I think we ought to look at the language of this resolution as a full council to make a difference between our expectation to meet our constitutional obligations and not pretending that this consent decree is making it harder because they haven't changed the terms of the rules since. I want to see, but I'd like to submit with the administration and with others in the community before we finally pass this. Thank you for letting me have my soapbox, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Davis. Mayor's conference room. And then Councilor Benton.
Mr. Chair, thank you for letting us speak. We do think that reform is important, but we also thought that there needed to strike a balance, and we've started to make some changes. And we have as Deputy Chief Lowe here. She could talk about some of the things that we've done and some of the things that we're looking at moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her right now.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and councilors. Thank you. We understand that the Garland memo stated improvements for consent decrees only applies to future consent decrees. However, the city has been taking action in numerous areas. So I wanted to start with, in March of 2020, we actually worked with the monitoring team in DOJ to approve a self-assessment plan. And what that means is APD would basically take the place of the monitor on certain paragraphs. So we did get that approved. However, that is right when the middle of COVID hit. And we had a lot of work from home and we didn't really want that to stifle our progress. In the summer of 2021, we started planning again to reevaluate this self-assessment plan. And we started hiring more personnel who will essentially take the place of the monitor and do our compliance evaluations every 6 months, very similar to the monitor. And we continue to look at the IMRs, the independent monitor report. All of those paragraphs remain in operational compliance. That is a very big deal because that means that we can start the 2-year time limit on those. There are 62 paragraphs that we have submitted for self-assessment. That's roughly 22% of the settlement agreement. That is a big deal because that takes a lot of lift where we'll be able to evaluate if we can reduce the monitor's fees, right? Like the less that he's evaluating and we're doing it ourselves, it should be able to bring that down and we can be able to evaluate that as this gets approved. In addition, in spring of 2021, we really started looking at the cost of paragraphs that we weren't in operational compliance and we were trying to develop a plan forward, discussing ways to potentially revise the settlement agreement to where there's more objective language in there. So we just know exactly what we need to do to be able to obtain it. By the end of 2021, we completed those evaluations and however, those requirements will include substantive amendments to the settlement agreement, which does require us to go through the DOJ. But some of those examples include use of force. I know a lot of you guys talked about the crux of why they are here, which is use of force, and we really want to come down to that. And to also match the settlement agreement with our active CBAs, because that's where the administrative investigations and the timelines for discipline are impacted. And so we're preparing a motion for substantial amendments, and we'll continue to work with the DOJ, who stated in the December 16, 2021 court hearing that they will continue to work with APD moving forward. So everyone's on the same page as, essentially with the goal of them getting out of here. And it's once those revisions are approved and implemented, we'll be in a much better place to evaluate and determine if it's appropriate to renegotiate the whole CASA, and then and more focus on the areas outlined in the findings letter, which again is use of force. And again, as like Councilor Bazan talked about a little bit earlier, we'll also be in a better position to determine if we need to request a different monitor for as appropriate, because that did come up in the Garland memo, and we'll take that into consideration. We have been taking that into consideration since IMR 13. So that is an option to reevaluate when going through negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Benton, I see your hand is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so a couple of things. One, just in response to Councilor Bassan's question, which I think is an important part and was just addressed there from the administration. My understanding, and this is just my understanding, is that the the judge at the last, I believe it was the last hearing, did ask the administration directly whether they were interested in replacing the monitor, and the judge was told no. And I believe the words were not at this time. That's just for everyone's information. So that was actually offered by the judge, and we declined, at least for the time being. I do appreciate this resolution and the intent, and it does certainly have merit for us to discuss. I certainly believe as a full council, this committee is a great place to get it going, but also a discussion of the full council would be merited. And but just with regard to the judge and our role as a council in this whole thing, we have a fairly minor role in the CASA. It's primarily has to do with the civilian police oversight, and Councilor Bassan and Councilor Davis and I think we're getting pretty close on and Councilor Bassan put in the yeoman's work on this, but also Julia and Chris really have helped with this, and I think we're in discussions with Ms. McDermott, Director McDermott from the CPOA, acting director. We're getting some good input. I think we're getting close on that. But I think at some point, we might want to, and maybe through this ordinance, we might want to ask to speak before the judge. And I'd be happy to do that, represent the council as your president, depending on, regardless of how this bill turns out. So I just wanted to make those points. And, we've been criticized by the monitor too, and by the DOJ, we as a council, for not having kept the CPOA board completely full. It's easier said than done. We're going to try to make it more easy and try to do better at keeping that board fully populated. It's critical to the whole process and what's expected of us. I'm sure some folks may not like that there's such a board, but it's a fact, and it's necessary under the CASA, and this is our piece of the work. So just wanted to make those comments, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Those comments are very, very good comments and very important comments. I'm going to call on Councilor Grout, since she's a member of the committee, and then I'll call on Councilor Lewis. He also has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support this bill. I do think that there were issues several years ago, and I think that the police and the union and the city have made great strides. I do think that there is a need for changing the monitor and renegotiating this settlement agreement for sure. So I am in support of this.
Thank you, Councilor Grout. And Councilor Lewis.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Just a few more comments and some clarification. I realize I'm not a voting member of this committee, so thank you. Thank you for letting me comment a little bit more. Just to clarify, the resolution does, really the key to this resolution is it recognizes Merrick Garland's recommendations that he made. And he did make recommendations specifically for future consent decrees. But I thought there was merit to be able to have this discussion and certainly hopefully to be able to open up the agreement again and be able to put some of those guidelines into this place. And two that are specifically mentioned in the bill. By the way, the bill doesn't talk about ending the agreement. The bill doesn't talk about sending the DOJ away or anything like that. I know there's been some comments related to that, but what the bill does is simply address those guidelines. And one of them specifically does have to do with the monitor. And as far as capping the spending on what we pay to the monitor, I mean, what we've sent, I mean, one of the other roles, Councilor Benton, that the council has is that we write a blank check to that monitor every single year. And so I think that, the reason why the Attorney General included that in these guidelines because I think there's been complaints from around the country, from congressmen around the country where these consent decrees are in place, and there's complaints of ineffectiveness and complaints of possibly even just misspent money, things like that that are just that led him to be able to make these agreements. And the other is an end date for that monitor. I want to be very specific. He didn't make it a recommendation that the agreement should have an end date, that it should only be 5 years, but he did make some recommendations regarding the monitor in that regard as well. And so again, the intent of this resolution is to give the administration the support that you all need, and I think that you all express that desire in some of the ways that you're approaching opening up the agreement again and looking at changes. And so hopefully this will give them some support to be able to address those issues. And from this council, having some support there in that regard. So thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Lewis. And councilors, I'm going to go ahead and make my comment, and it's pretty easy. I support the bill as well. So I think it's time for a vote. Ms. Montoya.
Counselor Bassan,
Yes.
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Counselor Davis,
Yes.
Counselor Grout,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez.
Yes.
That passes on a 5-0 vote.
Okay, we will move on to agenda item agenda items E, which is EC-18. And we're moving to City of Albuquerque Labor Management Relations Ordinance, multi-year collective bargaining agreement with the Albuquerque Police Officers Association. I move approval. Councilors, anybody second? Councilor Bassan, Councilor Grout, thanks for the second. Councilors, any questions for the staff or the administration?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I do have a question if I may.
Oh, there you go. Your hand blends in with the background.
Oh. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, this is another question that I think is something that it's not necessarily a question so much as that I think we need to ponder it, that I realize this is a move of approval. We're going to, decide if we want to accept this or not. I kind of think it's a done deal. Of course, I support it. However, I wonder with this bill and with R209 and the mandates and how that would be affected once this gets passed. If we end up passing Councilor Lewis's bill where there's a 1/8% reduction in the taxes, I mean, how does all of this lump together? Because I really think that if one passes, there's a domino effect involved. So I guess I am questioning, what do we do to make sure that we don't screw this up? Because there's 3 very important bills that are lingering out there that we can't not pass our collective bargaining agreement, in my opinion, but it's going to have an impact based off of whether or not we mandate things. How does that work with collective bargaining agreements? And what is that going to do if we end up cutting taxes? Perhaps it's for the administration.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. Councilor Benton.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I defer to that question for administration if Councilor Bassan would like.
I do. Thank you. Unless you have a good answer for it too, but I think it's something worth talking about. How do all of these interlink? Because if one gets approved and the other doesn't, or if they all were to get approved, or how does this affect Albuquerque and what should we be aware of?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Bassan, we had the discussion yesterday inside the FGO meeting where we talked about the finances. Sanjay Baka, our CFO, he was able to explain a lot of the different, how this stuff intertwines. We know that since this is a multi-year agreement, that's why council does have to approve it. We do have Assistant City Attorney Ian Stover that can explain that component. I do believe, and I'll have to have him verify this, but inside the contract, it's subject to appropriations. But I'll let him explain the legal reasons and how it has to go through, and if that particular clause is in this contract.
Good afternoon. My name is Ian Stoker. I'm an assistant city attorney in the Employment and Labor Division in our legal department. So the reason that this comes to you all is under the Labor Management Relations Ordinance, any multi-year collective bargaining agreement that contains economic components has to go for approval to the council. The way that approval what it looks like is if there were, say, terms in the current fiscal year that required an additional appropriation to meet those terms, then the council would need to act on that through either an appropriation or disappropriation. The agreement in question contemplates economic components for the following fiscal year, next fiscal year 23. However, appropriations are only made in and for each fiscal year. So there's no obligation at this time for the council to approve appropriations into the future, if that makes sense.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may follow up.
Go ahead, Councilor Bazan.
Thank you, Mr. Stoker. I think that helps a little bit, but to me, I'm concerned because if we pass this, well, and I think you just said we almost don't need to pass it today, or we can pass it to the council, I realize, but I guess I'm really still hesitant, because if we were to pass this and then go and we just passed without rec, the bill about the mandate or the options for vaccination among our public safety officers. So then if that were to pass, how is that going to affect the collective bargaining agreement and the city of Albuquerque and how we go from there? So there's that part. But then on top of that, once we go through committee and we figure out what we're doing with the bill that we had last night at FGO, talking about, the taxes or the 3/8%, and whether it should be just a quarter. I mean, how does that affect it? And I think they're all very directly related. And I know how I feel about it personally and how I want to vote, but I don't think that we should do this without having the conversation and all being very aware at how interrelated all three of these bills really are. Mr. Stoker, am I on the right track that they are probably very interlinked?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Bassan, if I may, if this bill does come out of committee today, it will be on the same agenda as the other pieces of legislation. So I think it would be probably a good time to discuss it. Like you said, they all kind of intertwine. So having all three of those pieces of legislation on the same agenda, I think would be beneficial to the public and to the council, and to have that discussion at the same time.
Okay, Mr. Chair, thank you. I will reserve and repeat all of this when we talk about all the others later. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. Councilor Benton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just to clarify, the fiscal bills from last night remain in committee, so that will remain in the FGO committee for discussion. So to the extent that that affects any discussion of this contract at the council, I did want to point out another fact, and again, I'll just reiterate that the COVID bill that we did just now moved to full council, that does have provisions requiring, and Ms. Collodon knows what those are if we need clarification, but those do require and acknowledge that the administration would have to confer with the two unions in order for that to go into effect. But I think the other point I wanted to bring up, and Mr. Melendez might be able to speak to this, and possibly Mr. Stoker. My big concern with this contract was the process by which it was negotiated by the administration. And and I know that these were, and we've talked about this under the previous council and under the previous Committee on Guidelines for Negotiations, which still exists, and we still have that as a venue to discuss future contracts. But what we experienced there, I'll put it in my really dumb layman's terms, and then Mr. Melendez can correct me. But basically, the Committee on Guidelines for Negotiation creates a venue, and it's really one of the few venues where council gets to weigh in on union negotiations. Primarily, they are left up, as certainly the many of the non-financial provisions of the negotiations are not under our current ordinances under the purvey of the City Council. However, this Committee on Guidelines for Negotiation was created years ago, long before my time, or at least a short time before my time. I don't remember it existing prior, to allow in advance of negotiations commencing for the council and this small committee, it's a combined committee of the council administration, to have discussions as to what the city's goals are entering those negotiations. That did not happen in the case of this contract. The negotiations were commenced by the administration without any input from the council. By the time we heard that negotiations had commenced, we had a couple of meetings of the IGR committee. I guess it's a COG, a Committee on Guidelines for Negotiations. But we were very limited as to what could be discussed. But I'll just ask Mr. Melendez to just correct me and clarify what I'm talking about here. And that's probably the only reason that I might vote against this tonight. Not that I don't support most of the contract. And I'd be willing to move it to full council with that recommendation, but I don't think I can vote for it to pass at this time. But anyway, Mr. Melendez, could you clarify that and make sure I haven't misspoken?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Benton, I don't believe you have misspoken. I think you're correct that the Guidelines Committee has not existed forever, but it has existed for some amount of time. I think it was created to deal specifically with sort of what you're speaking to, that the labor management ordinance limits the council's approval of this contract to the financial aspects of it. But nonetheless, this type of agreement between the city and a labor union can include policy implications that the council may have an interest in. And so the Guidelines Committee, I think, was intended to give that opportunity for council to weigh in during the negotiation process and to make sure that the council isn't getting cross with the limitations of the negotiation process and fair bargaining. Perhaps that ordinance has a little bit of a shortcoming in that it does not include explicit trigger for at what point the Guidelines Committee is supposed to be noticed that negotiations have commenced. And so there may be an opportunity to address that within that particular ordinance to ensure that the council actually has that seat as contemplated by that committee structure for future negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. Melendez. I also have Union President Sean Willoughby, Police Union President Sean Willoughby wanting to speak.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much for the opportunity. I actually did sign up for this piece of legislation. Thank you, councilors. We put a lot of work in this particular contract, and I want to address a couple of things. This contract is an old contract. It's about a half a year late. We had this contract solidified. We did go through guidelines, and my understanding of the Guidelines Committee, we were supposed to stick to only financial needs. I create a PowerPoint. I can share them with you for years previous. We don't really discuss the ins and outs of the policies or contract language that are coming forward. However, I would like to add to some of the comments of Councilor Benton, not one time, not once have I been contacted by Albuquerque Forward or anybody in the parties that are interested in our contract to ask us to consider any language that would be betterment for them. We worked very hard on this contract, addressing very complicated issues. Number one, I'd like to remind you of the RJ Berry time when he just unilaterally didn't approve a contract and we had almost a 10% wage reduction. It was devastating for this police department. It would be devastating for this police department, for this council not to approve this particular contract. I would like to address also two issues from Councilor Bazan. Number one, the COVID restrictions and mandates, that could be handled in an MOU and independent negotiations for that specific issue with the city. If that were to pass, I pray that it does not, but we could handle that independently of the contract. And I think that my own opinion on this, that it would be short-sighted and ill-equipped to consider a reduction in tax revenue for this city in uncertain times. We have been flush with cash. We have a lot of federal money. I don't believe that we've had the true impact of COVID. I don't believe that we've really seen the economy rest through COVID and then start to grow again with our job numbers and numbers of inflation. We've got the Fed that's going to raise rates at least 4 times this year. I do not believe it would be expedient or wise for this council to talk about tax reductions, but that would have an impact of you being able to appropriate the necessary funds for this expensive business that gets more and more costly every single year as you compete from the best and brightest in law enforcement, retention, and recruiting in the city of Albuquerque. As you know, we lost over 200 police officers in the last 2 years. We lost over 179 officers last year and over 81 officers the year before. Our natural attrition rate is 60 officers a year. So we have a lot of work to do. We're budgeted for 1,200. We have arrested about 900 police officers. So this is important. We've also covered a lot of the timeline issues and investigations. We've expanded the timeline issues. We've taken consideration from our labor board who made a ruling on cases that we were in dispute about. This contract is something the APOA is proud of. The city administration and their negotiating team worked hard on it as well. I have to commend them for their efforts. And the police officers that we represent overwhelmingly passed this contract. I believe it was over 314 that voted for this contract and only 14 people voted against it. And I was told that they voted against it because they thought that they deserved a little bit more money. But all in all, this is a good contract. I think it's going to solidify a lot of needs in the city of Albuquerque. And I pray that you pass this for immediate action or pass it right now, whatever you guys can do. Thank you so much.
Mr. Willoughby, thank you so much for your comments. The information that we just received was very, very good. One of my comments is that, sure, based on what Mr. Melendres says, that we can work later on to put the trigger in place, but I honestly believe that we need to move forward. And it looks like I've got Councilor Bassan and Councilor Benton wanting to make another comment. And I'm not sure who was first. I think it was Councilor Benton.
I believe it was Councilor Bassan.
Okay, Councilor Bassan.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't mean to, if I hope I didn't confuse anything earlier to the point of me saying that we need to really think about the intricacies. I guess the one thing I left off is this is the one bill in all of those 4 that I think is really required, that it's necessary. We need our officers to have stability. We need to be able to do this moving forward. This is standard for a lot of what we need to make sure that our department has so that we can continue to fight crime and reduce it. I think that the rest of it, we need to really see how it's going to be impacted. I appreciate that Mr. Willoughby clarified the MOU option. I think that helps a lot because it checks one of those off of my concern list that we can do independently without really going back to that domino effect. But I fully support passing the CC. I think that it needs to be done. And then I hope that we as a council, whether it be in the FGO where we deferred the bills or whether it be at full council when it comes to the potential, I hate calling it a mandate. It really isn't. I agree with that. It's not technically a mandate, but the other vaccination requirement bill, I think that we need to really be cautious and really evaluate it. I do support this though.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. Councilor Benton.
Yeah, just quickly, not to dominate here, and I know everyone wants to get on with this, but yeah, just to be really clear in response to Mr. Willoughby's comment. And just to clarify about the Committee on Guidelines, that's what it is. It's like, it gives an opportunity for us to collectively, as a council, say, here are some things operationally within the contract, not dollar issues necessarily, but operational issues within the contract. And I'm not talking about the DOJ, CASA, anything like that, but rather just things like how the bid works, where we talked about, and I know there's some incentives for sticking with your bid for multiple years, and I think that's great. That's on the right track. But the reason I say this is because I constantly hear from my constituents, gosh, every year I've got a whole new group of faces to get to know, and after the bid. And so that's a non-financial matter, right? That technically, at least going into the negotiations, the council should have some discussion that, we do need to fix the language and make some triggers where we can commence this. But I just wanted to make that clear that it wasn't anything about CASA or anything like that, or discipline or anything else, rather having to do with how our community is served by the union contract. And that's all that really was. I would support a motion, and I'll make a motion, in fact, for immediate action after we vote on this, if the vote's successful.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. I also have Councilor Lewis waiting.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I realize I might be outliving my welcome, so I apologize to the members of this committee. You can call me the sixth member if you'd like, but I'll keep it very brief. Regarding the question on how this bill relates to the other bills that are on the table, I don't think it's unlike any other commitments that we've made. The city's made a lot of financial commitments over the last year that we're going to have to consider in our budget, and certainly have to consider when we look at a tax reduction or allocating certain monies. So I don't think there's anything wrong with passing this bill, even passing it on immediate action. Personally, I support it. I will support it in the full council. And then I think it'd be entirely appropriate to say, we're giving everything that the union needs. We're providing our police department with everything that it needs financially. And, we still might have an opportunity to be able to take a serious look at being able to have enough revenue that we could return, back to the voters and be able to do a tax reduction. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with having that discussion and having it in this order as well. And I would hope that Sean made some great comments, and I would hope that Sean and any other department, anybody else where dollars have been committed in multiple years, which there's many, I would hope that Sean and others would say, appreciate the council for giving us everything we need. And at the same time, of course, being able to take a look at something that might make sense, like a tax reduction, when there's indications that there's possibly overages to our revenue and exceeding our revenue when the mayor makes a public statement a few weeks ago and says that the city of Albuquerque does not have a money problem, that we have the money that we need. When we're in this kind of situation, then I think it's important that we have these kind of discussions and we take a serious look at these things. Thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Davis. Anyone else have any more comments? All right, I'm going to go ahead and throw my comments in there. I started, but I keep on missing the hands raised, so I apologize for that. But me being a former police officer, know how important it is to be part of an organization that's trying to move forward. And that vote of 314 to 14 tells me that the officers who we need to support and back up are telling us that they've gone through this with a fine-tooth comb, and they have overwhelmingly approved their contract. I hear over and over, as Councilor Benton stated, that we always need to keep the officers in their area commands. It's really important. I also think it's important that the commanders stay in their area commands and don't move often as well. That's the biggest thing that I hear from my constituents, is that they want the commanders to stay, as well as the officers. That's how you develop relationships. That's how you develop true community policing. And I think that is a component that I really, really like and support within this contract. I think it's extremely important. The other side of it, the guiding council, I think we can still add that trigger in later on to make sure that it doesn't happen the next time around, or make sure that we actually deal with it in a way that we can all have the input that we need. I think it's really important that the officers get to work and that they know that we support them. And so that being said, I'm ready to move for the vote to approve APD's contract. Ms. Montoya.
And just to clarify, we're first moving the approval, and then Councillor Benton, you will be moving the immediate action? Perfect. Councillor Bassan?
Yes.
Councillor Benton?
Yes.
Councillor Davis?
Yes.
Councillor Grout?
Yes.
Councillor Sanchez?
Yes.
And that passes on a 5-0 vote.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the immediate action for this bill.
Second by Councillor Davis. Ms. Montoya.
Councillor Bassan?
Yes.
Councillor Benton?
Yes.
Councillor Davis?
Yes.
Councillor Grout?
Yes.
Councillor Sanchez?
Yes.
And that passes on a 5-0 vote.
Okay, there being no further business.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to congratulate you on your first meeting. You did an outstanding job. I'm actually having enough time to go back and do other work because it's before 5 o'clock. You did it. You did great.
Thank you. Okay, there being no further business, this Public Safety Committee meeting is adjourned. Thank you.